He had just spent his final $800 at a government surplus auction, buying this forgotten airfield in rural Nebraska after losing his cattle operation to drought and debt. What he thought was simply his last chance at affordable shelter would soon reveal something far more dangerous: classified documents hidden in a sealed bunker beneath. Hangar 7, containing the very nuclear launch codes that had mysteriously vanished from Strategic Air Command headquarters 3 decades ago. Little did Marcus know that his desperate bid for survival had just placed him at the center of the most explosive cover-up in American military history. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this grabs your attention, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have another mind-blowing discovery waiting for you. The October wind cut across the Nebraska plains like a knife, carrying with it the scent of dying corn and the promise of an early winter. Marcus Chen pulled his battered 2009 Ford F-150 into the gravel parking lot of the Hartwell County Administration Building, the truck's engine making that troubling, rattling sound that had started 3 weeks ago. At 34, the third generation rancher looked far older than his years, his face weathered by months of sleepless nights and the kind of bone-deep stress that comes from watching everything your family built crumble before your eyes. The foreclosure notice in his jacket pocket had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn thin, threatening to tear the document that would officially end the Chen family's 70-year legacy in Nebraska agriculture. 48 hours, First National Bank of Omaha would seize the 2,500-acre ranch that Marcus's grandfather, Chen, had purchased with savings from working the Transcontinental Railroad. The same land where Marcus's father had taught him to ride, to work cattle, and to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes days before they arrived. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was about to bid on property with money earned from selling the last of his grandfather's prize Angus bulls. The cattle that had once represented the future of the Chen ranch had been auctioned that morning for barely enough to cover outstanding feed bills. The buyers, mostly corporate operations from Iowa and Kansas, had smelled his desperation from across the sale ring. They'd watched him avoid eye contact, noticed the tremor in his voice when he accepted bids that were insultingly low, but represented his only hope of walking away with cash. The sequence of disasters that had led Marcus to this moment felt surreal in their completeness. The drought of 2021 had been bad, but manageable. The drought of 2022 had forced him to sell half his herd and take out loans against the ranch to buy hay from as far away as Montana. But it was the mysterious cattle disease that appeared in early 2023 that had delivered the killing blow. Veterinarians from the state university had never definitively identified the pathogen that swept through what remained of his herd. Symptoms defied easy categorization. Cattle would appear healthy one day and be dead within hours, with no warning signs that Marcus's decades of experience had taught him to recognize. By the time the disease burned itself out, he'd lost 180 head of cattle, each one representing not just immediate income, but years of careful breeding and genetic improvement. The insurance settlement had covered perhaps 60% of the livestock value, and even that had taken 8 months of paperwork and legal battles to collect. Meanwhile, the bills had continued mounting: veterinary costs for the doomed animals, disposal fees for the carcasses, loan payments on equipment purchased during better times, property taxes on land that was no longer generating income. Marcus's father, Robert Chen, had worked himself to exhaustion trying to save the operation, often spending 18-hour days in the fields and barns, desperately seeking solutions that seemed increasingly elusive. The heart attack that killed him had been sudden, but not surprising to anyone who had watched him shoulder stress that would have broken most men. At 62, Robert died believing he had failed his father's legacy and left his son with an impossible burden: the medical bills from Robert's final hospitalization had consumed what little remained of the family's emergency savings. Marcus had found himself in the surreal position of liquidating his father's personal possessions, tools accumulated over decades, farming equipment passed down through generations, even his grandfather's vintage 1967 Chevy pickup just to keep the utilities connected and buy groceries. Friends and neighbors had offered help, but Marcus's pride and their own financial struggles had limited what support was available. Rural Nebraska had been hemorrhaging family farms for years, victims of consolidation, climate change, and economic forces that favored large corporate operations over multi-generational family enterprises. The Chen Ranch was simply the latest casualty in a war that had been raging across the agricultural heartland for decades. Now, clutching the $847 from that morning's cattle sale money that represented the liquidation of his family's life work, Marcus entered the government surplus auction with a plan born of desperation rather than hope. He had spent the previous evening researching available properties, and only one item fell within his pathetic price range: Lot 23. Riverside Municipal Airport, described in the auction catalog as abandoned aviation facility, approximately 47 acres, sold as is, with no warranties or guarantees. Minimum bid $500. The auction room felt hostile in its sterile efficiency. Perhaps 25 people occupied folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Mostly scrap dealers and property speculators who attended these events regularly, hunting for bargains that could be quickly flipped for profit. Marcus felt conspicuously out of place among the business suits and leather portfolios, his work-worn hands fidgeting with the property description that he'd read dozens of times. County auctioneer Dale Morrison, a thin man with the rapid-fire delivery style of someone who had been calling auctions for 30 years, moved through the preliminary lots with mechanical precision. Office furniture from closed government buildings, surplus vehicles with mechanical problems, outdated computer equipment that no agency wanted to maintain, the detritus of bureaucracy being efficiently converted to cash. Out 23 Morrison announced, consulting his clipboard with practiced indifference. Riverside Municipal Airport, decommissioned in 2019 following state budget cuts. Property includes approximately 47 acres with 3 aircraft hangars, control tower, administrative building, and associated infrastructure. Significant renovation required. Environmental assessment on file indicates no hazardous materials present. Opening bid $500. Marcus raised his hand with more confidence than he felt, heart hammering as Morrison acknowledged his bid with a curt nod. The auctioneer's eyes swept the room, seeking competing bids that would drive up the price and increase the county's revenue. From the sale? $500 bid? Do I hear $600? Silence. Marcus held his breath, afraid to move lest he somehow trigger a bidding war he couldn't afford to fight. $500 once, Morrison called, his tone suggesting mild disappointment at the lack of interest. $500 twice. At the last moment, a man in an expensive suit near the front raised his hand. $600. Marcus's stomach dropped. He'd prepared for this possibility, but hoped the property's remote location and obvious maintenance challenges would discourage serious investors. He raised his hand again. $700. The man in the suit glanced back at Marcus, clearly evaluating whether this scruffy rancher represented serious competition. After a moment's consideration, he shook his head and returned his attention to the auction catalog. Apparently, an abandoned airport in rural Nebraska wasn't worth fighting. For against someone who looked desperate enough to overpay, $700 once, $700 twice, Morrison's voice echoed through the room. Do I hear $800? Marcus surprised himself by raising his hand again. The additional $100 represented money he couldn't afford to spend. That losing the auction would leave him with no options, except sleeping in his truck or begging relatives for temporary shelter while he searched for work. $800, Morrison acknowledged. $800 once, $800 twice, sold to bidder 47 for $800. Walking out of the building 20 minutes later with the property deed in his jacket pocket, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and terror that left him lightheaded. He had a place to live, technically, but no money remaining for utilities, basic repairs, or even food beyond what was currently in his truck. The ranch, where 5 generations of his family had prospered, was lost forever, traded for an abandoned airport that he knew virtually nothing about. County Records Clerk Patricia Williams was waiting by her Buick in the parking lot, having witnessed the entire transaction from her position near the registration table. A kind woman in her 50s who had processed various Chen family permits and licenses for nearly 2 decades, she approached Marcus with genuine concern written across her weathered features. "Marcus, honey, are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had watched too. "Many desperate people make questionable decisions. That airport's been sitting empty for 5 years now. Number. Electricity, no running water, and Lord only knows what condition those buildings are actually in." Marcus managed what he hoped resembled a confident smile. "It's what I can afford, Mrs. Williams, and it's got to beat sleeping in my truck for the winter." Patricia's expression softened with understanding. She had processed the paperwork for dozens of family farm foreclosures in recent years each, one representing generations of hard work and family history being erased by forces beyond individual control. The Chen family's situation was heartbreaking, but unfortunately not unique in modern rural Nebraska. The airport served this entire region for nearly 60 years, she explained as they walked toward her vehicle, her keys jingling in the cold wind. Started as a crop dusting operation back in 1963. Owned by the Morrison family, no relation to Dale, the auctioneer. By the 70s, it had expanded to handle small commercial flights, charter services, and quite a bit of private aircraft. Traffic. "What kind of private aircraft?" Marcus asked, curious despite his exhaustion and worry. "All sorts. Wealthy farmers with their own planes, business executives from Omaha and Lincoln, some government contracts during the Cold War years." Tricia paused, seeming to consider how much information to share. "My late husband, Tommy, worked aircraft. Maintenance there from 1983 until 2001, always said. There was more going on at that airport than most people realized." This piqued Marcus's interest in a way that nothing else had during this catastrophic day. "What kind of things?"
Patricia
glanced around the parking lot, as if checking to ensure their conversation wasn't being overheard. Tommy was never supposed to talk about the government contracts, you understand? Security clearances and non-disclosure agreements and all that. But after a few beers on a Saturday night, he'd sometimes mention that Offutt Air Force Base used Riverside for overflow operations. Marcus knew AFAT by reputation. Located 90 miles east near Omaha, it served as headquarters for Strategic Air Command during the Cold War and continued to house critical military communications and intelligence operations. The idea that his new property had connections to such a significant military installation was both intriguing and slightly unsettling. "Overflow operations?" he prompted. "Classified transport, sensitive cargo, that sort of thing," Patricia explained, fishing through her purse for the manila envelope containing the airport's documentation. Tommy said the government boys would show up with special aircraft, sometimes military planes with civilian markings, and they'd use the secured hangar for loading and unloading operations that regular personnel weren't allowed to observe. As they reached her car, Patricia handed Marcus the thick envelope. "These are all the keys we have on file, plus the building schematics, utility information, and what maintenance records survived the closure. The main terminal has an apartment upstairs where the airport manager used to live. Tommy always said it was actually quite nice, built better than most houses in town." Marcus accepted the envelope with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Williams. I know this probably looks like a mistake to you. Sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning," she interrupted gently, her eyes kind but serious. "Tommy used to say that about the airport, said it was built for something more important than what most people knew about. Maybe you'll figure out what he meant." She paused, seeming to weigh whether to share additional information. "Hey, there's one more thing, Marcus. When the state decided to close the airport, they sent crews to remove all the government equipment and secure any classified materials. But Tommy always believed they missed something, said there were parts of that facility that even the regular maintenance staff weren't allowed to access." Driving toward his new property as afternoon shadows lengthened across the endless Nebraska prairie, Marcus reflected on the surreal trajectory his life had taken in just one day. This morning, he had owned nothing but debt and the crushing weight of family disappointment. Now he possessed 47 acres of mysterious infrastructure and unlimited uncertainty about his future. The airport appeared gradually as he crested a low rise in the highway, its outlines stark and somehow imposing against the vast sky. A chain-link fence topped with weathered barbed wire surrounded the perimeter, suggesting security concerns that seemed excessive for a small municipal airport. 3 large hangars dominated the landscape, their metal siding dulled by years of weather, but appearing structurally sound from a distance. A modest control tower rose from the main terminal building. Like a lighthouse designed to guide aircraft rather than ships, its windows dark and empty. The runways, while cracked and weed-grown, showed evidence of quality construction that had withstood decades of Nebraska weather without complete deterioration. Marcus parked beside the main gate and used Patricia's keys to remove the heavy padlock securing the entrance. The screech of hinges protesting 5 years of neglect echoed across the empty facility as he drove onto property that was now, possibly, his home. The silence was profound and unsettling. After a lifetime surrounded by the sounds of cattle, farm equipment, and rural life, the airport's emptiness felt almost oppressive. Just wind whistling through broken windows, the distant cry of hawks circling overhead, and the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Marcus's first stop was the main terminal building, a 2-story structure that had clearly been built with both functionality and modest aesthetics in mind. The lower level contained what had once been a passenger waiting area, complete with rows of vinyl chairs and a ticket counter that still bore faded airline logos from carriers that had probably gone out of business decades ago. Behind the public areas, Marcus discovered office spaces, baggage handling areas, and a small restaurant kitchen that suggested the airport had once maintained food service for passengers. Everything was dusty and showed signs of hasty abandonment, but the basic infrastructure appeared sound. The upstairs apartment was more promising than Patricia's description had suggested. While water damage had stained some walls and broken windows had allowed weather and wildlife to claim portions of the space, the fundamental structure remained solid. With cleaning and basic repairs, the 5-room residence could certainly provide adequate shelter. The apartment's layout was surprisingly thoughtful. A living area with large windows overlooking the runways, a kitchen with commercial-grade appliances, 2 bedrooms, a full bathroom with both shower and tub, and what appeared to have been an office or communications room. Built-in storage throughout suggested the space had been designed for long-term residence rather than temporary accommodation. From the apartment's main window, Marcus could see all 3 hangars and most of the airport's infrastructure. Hangars 1 and 2 were positioned near the main runway, easily accessible for normal aircraft operations. But Hangar 7 numbered strangely. Since there appeared to be only 3 hangars total sat apart from the others near the facility's eastern perimeter, surrounded by additional fencing that created a secure compound within the larger airport grounds. Marcus spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring his new domain. Hangar 1 contained abandoned maintenance equipment, hydraulic lifts designed for aircraft service, tool benches equipped with specialized hardware and diagnostic computers from an earlier era of aviation technology. The concrete floor bore oil stains and tire marks that told the story of decades of aircraft maintenance and repair work. Hangar 2 stood almost completely empty, except for mounting brackets on the walls where equipment had once been installed and bulletin boards, still displaying faded safety notices and operational procedures. The vastness of the space was striking high ceilings and concrete floors designed to accommodate aircraft of substantial size. But it was Hangar 7 that captured Marcus's attention and curiosity. Unlike the other buildings, this structure had clearly been built with security as a primary consideration. Reinforced steel doors, small windows placed high on the walls for observation rather than illumination, and concrete construction that seemed significantly heavier than necessary for standard aircraft storage. As Marcus approached the building, he noticed that while Hangars 1 and 2 showed signs of hasty abandonment left behind, doors standing open to the elements Hangar 7 had been deliberately and thoroughly secured, multiple locks sealed. The main entrance, and a faded but still legible sign, warned authorized personnel only, security clearance required. Using keys from Patricia's collection, Marcus managed to open the exterior locks after considerable trial and error. But beyond the main door, he discovered an interior security barrier that required entirely different access credentials. Inner door featured an electronic keypad system, small LED display glowing red despite the airport's supposed disconnection from all utility services. "What the hell? Marcus muttered, running his fingers along the keypad's edges and examining its construction. The device appeared far more sophisticated than anything a small municipal airport would typically require, suggesting military or government origins. The keypad itself was manufactured by a company Marcus didn't recognize, with model numbers and security certifications that indicated design for high-level classified access. More intriguingly, the device clearly had power, which meant some electrical system remained active throughout the abandoned facility. As evening approached and temperature began dropping toward freezing, Marcus reluctantly left the mystery of Hangar 7 unsolved and returned to the terminal apartment to prepare for his first night as an airport owner. The apartment's utilities were indeed disconnected, but he'd expected that and had packed camping gear and battery-powered lights in his truck. The reality of his situation hit him as he spread his sleeping bag on the apartment floor. He was alone in an abandoned airport in the middle of rural Nebraska, with $8 remaining in his wallet and no immediate prospects for employment or income. The ranch where his family had prospered for 70 years was gone forever, and he had traded that legacy for a property that might be impossible to maintain or develop. Yet despite the uncertainty and fear, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: curiosity. Patricia's husband had believed this airport was built for something more important than what most people knew about. The sophisticated security system protecting Hangar 7 suggested classified operations that had continued long after the facility's official role as a municipal airport should have ended such activities. Standing at the apartment window as darkness fell across the Nebraska plains, Marcus watched lights flickering in the distance from the few remaining farmhouses scattered across the landscape. Each light represented a family that had managed to survive the economic forces that had destroyed his own operation. And he felt a mixture of envy and determination that surprised him with its intensity. Tomorrow, he would continue exploring his new property, starting with a more thorough investigation of the mysterious Hangar 7. Whatever lay behind that electronic security door had been considered important enough to warrant protection. Even after the airport's closure and abandonment, Marcus Chen had spent his last $800 on what appeared to be an impossible situation. But as he settled into his sleeping bag on the apartment floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had purchased something far more significant than 47 acres of abandoned infrastructure. The classified documents hidden beneath Hangar 7, containing nuclear launch protocols that had been missing from Strategic Air Command for 3 decades, waited in darkness just 200 yards from where Marcus was falling asleep, protected by a man who had died believing the truth would never emerge. Evidence of the most dangerous security breach in American military history lay undisturbed, waiting for someone desperate enough and curious enough to uncover secrets that powerful forces had killed to protect. Marcus had no way of knowing that his desperate bid for survival just placed him at the center of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and defense contracting. But tomorrow, his investigation of Hangar 7 would begin to reveal exactly what $800 had bought him at a government surplus auction in rural Nebraska. Marcus woke to the sound of wind rattling loose sheets of metal somewhere on the property, rhythmic banging that had invaded his dreams and left him disoriented in the gray pre-dawn light. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the industrial smell of old concrete and aviation fuel that seemed permanently embedded in the building's walls. Then reality crashed back. He was sleeping on the floor of an abandoned airport that he'd bought with his last $800, and today he would either find a way to make this desperate gamble work or admit complete defeat. Too near freezing overnight, and Marcus's breath misted as he climbed out of his sleeping bag. The apartment's heating system was disconnected along with the rest of the utilities, but he'd managed to stay reasonably warm with the camping gear he'd accumulated during better times. When he could afford hunting and fishing trips with his father, coffee would have to wait until he could figure out the electrical situation. But Marcus had water bottles and energy bars that would sustain him. While he began a more systematic exploration of his new property, yesterday's initial survey had raised more questions than answers, particularly regarding Hangar 7 and its sophisticated security system that somehow remained powered despite the facility's supposed complete disconnection from all utilities. Outside, the October morning was crisp and clear, with frost coating the weeds that had begun reclaiming the runway's edges. In daylight, the airport looked both more promising and more daunting than it had the previous evening. The infrastructure was substantial, clearly built to handle significant aviation operations, but 5 years of abandonment had taken their toll in ways that would require considerable time and money to address. Marcus decided to begin with a more thorough investigation of the utility systems, reasoning that understanding the power situation might explain how Hangar 7's security system remained active. Behind the main terminal, he discovered a small electrical substation that appeared to have been built for much greater capacity than a typical municipal airport would require. The main power line coming into the facility was indeed disconnected, with the meter removed and service cables clearly cut by utility crews during the closure process. But as Marcus examined the distribution system more carefully, he noticed something unusual: a secondary electrical feed that bypassed the main meter entirely, running underground toward the eastern section of the property where Hangar 7 was located. Following the buried cable required some detective work, but Marcus's experience with farm electrical systems had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of underground wiring, small utility markers, barely visible after years of weather and neglect, traced a path that led directly to Hangar 7's reinforced concrete foundation. "Government feed," Marcus muttered, recognizing the type of secondary power system that military installations often used for critical operations that couldn't be interrupted by civilian utility issues. Offutt Air Force Base, 90 miles away, probably had similar arrangements for maintaining power to classified systems during emergencies or maintenance periods. This discovery suggested that Hangar 7's security system was powered by a federal electrical supply that had never been disconnected when the airport closed. Either through oversight or deliberate decision, someone had maintained power to whatever classified operations had been conducted in that building. Armed with this information, Marcus returned to Hangar 7 with renewed determination to solve the access puzzle. The electronic keypad system appeared to be military-grade. It's probably designed for security clearances and access codes that would be meaningless to a civilian rancher from Nebraska. But Marcus had learned during his years managing complex farm operations that most security systems, no matter how sophisticated, included some form of emergency or maintenance access. Examining the keypad more carefully in daylight, he noticed manufacturer information that hadn't been visible the previous evening. Secure Tech Solutions. Model ST 2400 NSA approved. The National Security Agency certification confirmed his suspicion that this system had been designed for the highest levels of classified access. But below the main keypad, partially concealed by weather staining, Marcus discovered a smaller secondary panel with different markings. This appeared to be a maintenance override system, probably installed to allow authorized technicians to service the security equipment without requiring classified access codes. The maintenance panel was secured with a simple physical lock rather than electronic protection, suggesting it was designed for use by technical personnel who might not have security clearances but needed access to maintain the equipment. Marcus tried several keys from Patricia's collection before finding one that opened the small panel, revealing a set of manual switches and a basic numerical keypad with only 4 digits, instead of the main system's more complex requirements. A faded instruction card inside the panel provided the clue. Marcus needed maintenance override. Enter facility commission date, MMYY, followed by asterisk. The Riverside Municipal Airport had been established in 1963, according to Patricia's information. So Marcus tried 0163, followed by the asterisk key. The maintenance panel's green light flickered on, and he heard the distinctive click of electromagnetic locks disengaging throughout the security door system. His heart racing with excitement and apprehension, Marcus pushed the heavy door open and stepped into Hangar 7 for the first time. The interior was unlike anything he had expected. Rather than a typical aircraft hangar, the space had been divided into multiple levels and specialized areas that clearly indicated sophisticated military or intelligence operations. The main floor contained what appeared to be vehicle storage areas, but the vehicles themselves had been removed. leaving only mounting brackets and power connections that suggested specialized equipment had once been housed here. A staircase along the eastern wall led to an elevated observation area with windows overlooking the main hangar floor. But it was a second staircase, leading downward, that captured Marcus's attention. The lower level appeared to be built entirely below ground, extending beneath the hangar's foundation in a way that wouldn't be visible from outside the building. The basement level was accessed through another security door, but this one had been left unlocked, suggesting that whoever had secured the facility during its closure had focused on preventing access to the hangar itself rather than the underground areas. As Marcus descended the concrete stairs, emergency lighting automatically activated, indicating that the underground facility had its own independent power systems. The basement was extensive, much larger than the hangar above it, and clearly designed for long-term operations. Multiple rooms branched off from a central corridor, each labeled with alphanumeric codes rather than descriptive names. Storage. A7. Communications, Beta, Archive, Vault 1, Technical Services, and others that provided no clue about their actual functions. Most of the rooms were empty, their contents apparently removed during the facility's closure. But the room labeled Archive Vault 1 was different. Its door was heavier than the others, constructed of reinforced steel with multiple locking mechanisms. That suggested it had been designed to protect whatever was stored inside from both unauthorized access and potential destruction. Unlike the other areas, Archive Vault 1's door was not only locked, but secured with what appeared to be the original military-grade access system. A small metal placard beside the door bore warnings about authorized access, federal penalties for unauthorized entry, and references to classification levels that Marcus recognized from movies but had never encountered in real life, however. As Marcus examined the vault door more carefully, he noticed that one of the locking mechanisms appeared to have been deliberately disabled. A key cylinder had been removed, leaving a circular opening that suggested someone with proper authority had intentionally created a way to bypass part of the security system. Inside the circular opening, Marcus could see what appeared to be a manual release mechanism. His experience with farm equipment had taught him to recognize mechanical systems that could be operated by hand when power or electronic controls failed. After several minutes of careful manipulation, he managed to trigger the manual release, causing the vault door's primary locks to disengage with a series of metallic clicks that echoed through the underground facility. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a climate-controlled room filled with filing cabinets, document storage boxes, and several pieces of electronic equipment that had been carefully preserved in sealed containers. Unlike the rest of the underground facility, this room showed no signs of having been cleared out during the airport's closure. Marcus stepped into the vault cautiously, his footsteps muffled by industrial carpeting that had been installed to reduce static electricity around sensitive documents. The filing cabinets were labeled with date ranges spanning from 1983 to 1994, suggesting that this archive had been actively maintained for more than a decade before being sealed. The first cabinet Marcus examined contained routine administrative documents, personnel records, maintenance schedules, supply requisitions, and other paperwork that suggested normal military logistics operations. But as he moved through the files systematically, he began to notice patterns that indicated something far more significant than routine support activities. Multiple documents referenced Operation Deep Strike, a code name that appeared throughout the files but was never fully explained. Personnel involved in this operation required special security clearances beyond normal military classifications, and their activities were compartmentalized in ways that suggested extreme sensitivity. In the third filing cabinet, Marcus discovered a folder labeled Protocol Archive Emergency Authorization Codes. The documents inside were unlike anything he had ever seen: complex alphanumeric sequences, authentication procedures, and verification protocols that appeared to be related to nuclear weapons systems. As Marcus read through these files with growing alarm, he began to understand what he had discovered. The Riverside Municipal Airport had served as a secret backup facility for Strategic Air Command's nuclear launch protocols. During the height of the Cold War, when the threat of Soviet first strike was a constant concern, military planners had established hidden archives at civilian locations that could maintain command and control functions if primary bases were destroyed. One document stamped top secret eyes only and dated March 1994 made the situation devastatingly clear. It was a report filed by Colonel James Patterson, the officer responsible for maintaining the Riverside facility's security, documenting the theft of critical nuclear launch codes from the archive. According to Patterson's report, someone with high-level access had systematically copied the authentication protocols for the entire Minuteman III missile system, along with backup launch codes for submarine-based nuclear weapons. The theft had been discovered only when routine security audits revealed discrepancies in the archive's access logs. The investigation that followed, Marcus learned from reading Patterson's detailed reports, had been hampered by the classified nature of the facility and the small number of personnel who even knew of its existence. Suspects included military officers, defense contractors, and technical personnel who had required access to the protocols for maintenance and testing purposes. But the most shocking revelation came in Patterson's final report, dated June 1994. The investigation had been abruptly terminated by order of the Pentagon. With all evidence sealed and the case classified at levels that prevented even strategic air command senior officers from pursuing it further. Patterson's recommendation for enhanced security measures had been ignored, and within months, he had been reassigned to a remote posting in Alaska. As Marcus continued reading through the archived documents, he discovered that Patterson had not accepted the Pentagon's decision to close the investigation, working secretly and at great personal risk. The colonel had continued gathering evidence about the nuclear protocol theft, documenting connections between the suspected thieves and defense contractors who had been awarded billions of dollars in contracts for upgraded security systems following the incident. The pattern that emerged from Patterson's covert investigation was both clear and terrifying. The theft of nuclear launch codes had not been the work of foreign spies or terrorist organizations, but rather a coordinated effort by American defense. Contractors who had orchestrated the security breach in order to justify massive government contracts for new protection systems, companies like Stratton, Defense Systems, Apex Security Solutions, and Morrison Technologies had all received enormous contracts to address vulnerabilities in nuclear command systems, vulnerabilities that they themselves had created by stealing the original protocols. The theft had been a false flag operation designed to generate profits from the very security failures they had engineered. Patterson's files included detailed financial records showing how defense executives had personally profited from the post-theft contracts, along with evidence of political contributions and lobbying efforts that had ensured the investigation was terminated before it could expose their involvement. The colonel had identified a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and defense contracting. But his evidence had never been presented because powerful forces had silenced him before he could act. In the final folder, Marcus examined, he found Patterson's personal journal, handwritten entries that revealed the human cost of his investigation. The colonel had been systematically isolated from his colleagues, passed over for promotion, and subjected to harassment that had destroyed his military career. His family had received anonymous threats, and suspicious accidents had befallen other officers who had supported his investigation. Patterson's last journal entry, dated November 1994, is both resignation and warning. I have preserved the evidence here, in the one place they believe is secure from discovery. Know their fleas someday, when the political protections have faded and justice is possible again. Someone will find these files and complete the work that I could not. The American people deserve to know that their nuclear security was deliberately compromised by the very companies paid to protect it. Marcus sat in the archive vault for nearly an hour, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. The nuclear launch protocols that had been stolen in 1994 were still missing, still in the hands of defense contractors who had built an empire on the security vulnerabilities they had created. The billions of dollars in taxpayer money spent on enhanced protection systems had gone to the very criminals who had orchestrated the original theft. More disturbing still, Marcus realized that many of the companies implicated in Patterson's investigation were still operating, still receiving government contracts, still positioned to influence American defense policy. The conspiracy that had been covered up in 1994 had grown into a self-perpetuating system, where the fox guarded the henhouse and profited from every security failure it engineered. As Marcus carefully returned the documents to their proper files, he noticed something else: a sealed metal container in the vault's corner, labeled simply Authentication Protocols. Master Archive. Unlike the paper documents, this container had never been opened, its military-grade seals intact despite 3 decades of storage. Inside the container, Marcus discovered exactly what Patterson's reports had described: the complete set of nuclear launch authentication codes that had been stolen in 1994, but also backup copies of protocols for systems that had been developed since then. The vault contained not just historical evidence of past crimes, but current nuclear launch codes that could theoretically be used to authorize the deployment of American nuclear weapons. The implications were staggering. Marcus, a bankrupt rancher from Nebraska, possessed nuclear launch codes that governments would kill to obtain in that defense. Contractors had already committed treason to steal. He also held documentary evidence of a 30-year conspiracy that had compromised American nuclear security for corporate profit. As the weight of this discovery settled over him, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold: the sound of vehicles approaching the airport. Through the vault's small ventilation grate, he could see lights moving across the hangar floor above. Someone else was at the facility, and they were conducting a search rather than simply passing by. Marcus quickly sealed the authentication protocol container and activated the vault's security systems, ensuring that the evidence would be protected even if he was discovered. But as he climbed the stairs toward the main hangar level, he could hear voices echo through the building. Voices that suggested the visitors knew exactly what they were looking for and were prepared to use force to obtain it. The defense contractors, who had orchestrated the 1994 theft, had somehow learned that their secret was no longer safe. Marcus Chen, who had bought an abandoned airport to avoid sleeping in his truck, was about to discover that some secrets were worth killing to protect, and that his desperate bid for survival had placed him in the crosshairs of the most dangerous conspiracy in American history. Through Hangar 7's small windows, Marcus could see black SUVs surrounding the facility and armed men taking positions around the perimeter. The theft of nuclear launch protocols had remained hidden for 30 years. But now the criminals responsible were prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure their secrets stayed buried forever. Marcus had approximately 3 minutes to decide whether to run, hide, or stand, and fight for evidence that could expose the greatest betrayal in American military history. The choice he made in the next few moments would determine not only his own survival, but whether the truth about compromised nuclear security would ever see the light of day. Marcus's mind raced as he assessed his impossible situation. He was trapped in an underground vault beneath Hangar 7, surrounded by evidence of the most explosive conspiracy in American military history. While armed men systematically searched the facility above him, the voices echoing through the building's ventilation system were professional, methodical, and utterly ruthless in their efficiency. Thermal imaging shows the main terminal is clear. A voice reported through what sounded like military-grade communications equipment, "Moving to Hangar 1 now. Remember, if the package has been accessed, we contain the situation permanently." The casual reference to permanent containment sent ice through Marcus's veins. These weren't government agents conducting an official investigation, they were private contractors with orders to eliminate anyone who had discovered the truth about the stolen nuclear protocols. The defense companies that had orchestrated the 1994 theft were still protecting their secret 30 years later, and they had somehow learned that their hidden archive had been compromised. Marcus quickly gathered the most critical documents from Colonel Patterson's files: the investigation reports, the financial records connecting defense contractors to the theft. Most importantly, Patterson's detailed list of the conspirators who had escaped justice for 3 decades. The complete nuclear launch codes would have to remain in the vault. They were too dangerous to carry and too bulky to transport quickly. But as Marcus prepared to seal the vault and attempt an escape, he noticed something that changed everything: a secondary exit from the underground facility that Patterson had concealed behind a false wall in the archive room. The hidden passage appeared to lead toward the eastern edge of the property, away from the hangars where the search teams were concentrating their efforts. The passage was narrow and clearly designed for emergency evacuation rather than regular use. As Marcus crawled through the tunnel, he could hear muffled explosions from above. The search teams were using breaching charges to open secured areas throughout the facility. They weren't concerned about preserving evidence or maintaining cover. They intended to destroy everything that could connect them to the conspiracy. The tunnel emerged through a concealed hatch in an abandoned utility building nearly 300 yards from Hangar 7. From this position, Marcus could observe the full scope of the operation against him. At least 12 armed operatives had surrounded the airport, using military-style tactics to systematically clear each building. Black SUVs blocked all the obvious escape routes, and thermal imaging equipment swept the facility for any signs of human presence. These weren't hastily assembled corporate security guards. They were professional soldiers, probably former Special Forces operatives now working for private military contractors, the kind of personnel that defense companies employed for operations. That couldn't be officially acknowledged by any government agency. Marcus realized with growing alarm that the men hunting him represented the same criminal network that Colonel Patterson had tried to expose in 1994, the defense contractors who had stolen nuclear launch codes to justify billions in security. Contracts had evolved into a shadow organization with the resources and capability to eliminate threats anywhere in the world. Through the utility building's grimy windows, Marcus watched the team leader coordinate the search with practiced efficiency. The man wore expensive tactical gear and carried communications equipment that suggested real-time coordination with higher authority. This wasn't a fishing expedition. They knew exactly what they were looking for. And had precise intelligence about the hidden archive. Package located in Vault 1, the team leader reported into his radio. Contents appear intact, but access logs show recent entry. Unknown subject accessed the facility within the last 6 hours. Marcus's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. The Vault's security system had been recording his activities, creating a digital trail that proved someone had discovered Patterson's evidence. Even if he escaped the immediate danger, the conspirators would know their secret had been compromised and would hunt him relentlessly. But as Marcus watched the operatives work, he noticed something that gave him hope. They were focused entirely on containing and destroying evidence rather than pursuing a fugitive. Marcus sat in the archive vault for nearly an hour, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. The nuclear launch protocols that had been stolen in 1994 were still missing, still in the hands of defense contractors who had built an empire on the security vulnerabilities they had created. The billions of dollars in taxpayer money spent on enhanced protection systems had gone to the very criminals who had orchestrated the original theft. More disturbing still, Marcus realized that many of the companies implicated in Patterson's investigation were still operating, still receiving government contracts, still positioned to influence American defense policy. The conspiracy that had been covered up in 1994 had grown into a self-perpetuating system, where the fox guarded the henhouse and profited from every security failure it engineered. As Marcus carefully returned the documents to their proper files, moving carefully to avoid detection, Marcus worked his way toward the tree line that bordered the airport's eastern perimeter. His years of hunting and farm work in rural Nebraska had taught him to move quietly through rough terrain, skills that now meant the difference between life and death. The autumn vegetation provided some concealment, but the open ground between the utility building and safety seemed impossibly vast. As Marcus reached the edge of the property, he heard the distinctive whine of a helicopter approaching from the south. The aircraft wasn't military at civilian markings, suggested a corporate transport. But its arrival meant that higher-level authority was taking personal control of the operation. Someone important enough to fly in from outside the area was ensuring that the Riverside Airport situation was handled correctly. The helicopter touched down near the main terminal, and Marcus watched through binoculars as a man in an expensive business suit emerged. Even from a distance, the newcomer's bearing and the deference shown by the tactical team suggested this was a senior executive from one of the defense contractors involved in the original conspiracy. Through his radio, which Marcus could hear faintly from his concealed position, team leader reported directly to the helicopter passenger. "Sir, The archive has been accessed within the last 12 hours. Unknown subject reviewed multiple files and opened the protocol container. We're prepared to sanitize the entire facility. Negative, came the reply in a voice that carried absolute authority. The protocol container's access logs will tell us exactly what was removed. If launch codes are missing, we need that intelligence before we destroy the evidence. Find out who was here and what they took. Marcus realized that his careful handling of the nuclear protocols had worked against him. The sophisticated security systems protecting the authentication codes had recorded his every action, creating a detailed log of which documents he had accessed and how long he had spent with each file. The conspirators would know within hours exactly what evidence he possessed. But they had made one critical error. They assumed that whoever had discovered the archive was still hiding somewhere on the airport property. Marcus's escape through Patterson's hidden tunnel had taken him beyond their search perimeter, giving him a narrow window of opportunity to reach safety before they expanded their containment efforts. The question was where safety might exist for someone carrying evidence that powerful defense contractors were willing to kill to suppress. Local law enforcement was completely outmatched by professional military contractors, and federal agencies might include personnel compromised by the same corruption that had covered up the original theft in 1994. Marcus needed allies who were both capable of protecting him and trustworthy enough to handle evidence of nuclear security breaches without being bought, intimidated, or eliminated by the conspirators. In rural Nebraska, with limited resources and unknown enemies potentially everywhere, finding such allies seemed almost impossible. As Marcus worked his way through the countryside toward the nearest town, explosions lit up the night sky behind him. The defense contractors were destroying the underground archive, collapsing the tunnels and eliminating physical evidence that had taken Colonel Patterson years to gather. The facility where nuclear launch codes had been stored for 3 decades was being erased from existence by the very criminals who had stolen them. But the documents in Marcus's jacket pocket contained enough evidence to expose the conspiracy. If he could survive long enough to present them to authorities, who wouldn't be corrupted or intimidated by defense industry influence? Patterson's investigation had identified specific executives, documented financial transactions, and traced the flow of stolen taxpayer money from manufactured security breaches to corporate profits. The nearest town was Milbrook, population 1,847, located 8 miles from the airport along rural highways that would offer little concealment if pursuit vehicles appeared. Marcus had no transportation except his own feet, no communication equipment except his basic cell phone, and no allies except whatever help he might find among small-town Nebraska residents, who probably had no idea that defense contractors operated private armies. But as Marcus walked through the pre-dawn darkness, he remembered something Patricia Williams had mentioned during his property purchase. Her nephew worked for the Nebraska State Patrol and had often expressed concerns about federal overreach and corporate influence in local law enforcement matters. Deputy Sheriff Tom Williams might be exactly the kind of ally Marcus needed, someone with official authority but no connections to the defense industry corruption network. The 8-mile walk to Milbrook took Marcus nearly 3 hours, moving carefully across farmland and staying away from roads where surveillance might detect him. By sunrise, he reached the outskirts of town, exhausted but alive, carrying evidence that could change American history if he could find someone with the courage and integrity to act on it. Milbrook's main street looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, family-owned businesses, a classic courthouse, a kind of small-town atmosphere where everyone knew their neighbor's business. But beneath this peaceful facade, Marcus was about to discover whether ordinary Americans would stand up to extraordinary corruption when their country's security had been deliberately compromised for corporate profit. The Nebraska State Patrol office occupied a modest building next to the courthouse, staffed by officers who handled everything from traffic violations to domestic disputes across 3 rural counties. Deputy Sheriff Tom Williams was just beginning his morning shift when a desperate rancher walked through his door, carrying evidence of the most explosive conspiracy in American military history. Deputy Williams Marcus asked, approaching the desk where a stocky man in his 40s was reviewing overnight incident reports. "I'm Marcus Chen, and I need to report a crime that involves stolen nuclear launch codes and defense contractor conspiracy. I know how that sounds, but I have documentary evidence, and there are armed men trying to kill me to keep this secret." Tom Williams looked up from his paperwork with the expression of someone who had heard every possible story during 15 years of rural law enforcement. But as Marcus began explaining his discovery at the airport and showed him Colonel Patterson's investigation files, the deputy's demeanor shifted from skepticism to serious concern. "Son, if what you're telling me is true, this is way beyond anything we can handle at the county level," Williams said after examining the documents. "These allegations involve federal crimes, military security, and people with resources that could crush anyone who gets in their way." "I know," Marcus replied, "but I also know that local corruption is harder to control than federal agencies that might be compromised." Colonel Patterson tried to work through military channels in 1994 and got shut down by people in Washington. "Maybe the answer is to start with honest cops in small towns and build up from there." Williams considered this for several minutes, studying Patterson's files with the careful attention of someone who understood that his next decision would define the rest of his career. Finally, he reached for his radio and made a call that would change everything. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need you to contact FBI agent Sarah Chen at the Omaha field office." Moving carefully to avoid detection, Marcus worked his way toward the tree line that bordered the airport's eastern perimeter. His years of hunting and farm work in rural Nebraska had taught him to move quietly through rough terrain, skills that now meant the difference between life and death. The autumn vegetation provided some concealment, but the open ground between the utility building and safety seemed impossibly vast. As Marcus reached the edge of the property, he heard the distinctive whine of a helicopter approaching from the south. The aircraft wasn't military at civilian markings, suggested a corporate transport. But its arrival meant that higher-level authority was taking personal control of the operation. Someone important enough to fly in from outside the area was ensuring that the Riverside Airport situation was handled correctly. The helicopter touched down near the main terminal, and Marcus watched through binoculars as a man in an expensive business suit emerged. Even from a distance, the newcomer's bearing and the deference shown by the tactical team suggested this was a senior executive from one of the defense contractors involved in the original conspiracy. Through his radio, which Marcus could hear faintly from his concealed position, team leader reported directly to the helicopter passenger. "Sir, the archive has been accessed within the last 12 hours. Unknown subject reviewed multiple files and opened the protocol container. We're prepared to sanitize the entire facility." "Negative," came the reply in a voice that carried absolute authority. "The protocol container's access logs will tell us exactly what was removed. If launch codes are missing, we need that intelligence before we destroy the evidence. Find out who was here and what they took." Marcus realized that his careful handling of the nuclear protocols had worked against him. The sophisticated security systems protecting the authentication codes, the defense contractors had moved faster than Marcus anticipated, using their influence to paint him as a terrorist rather than a whistleblower. Within hours of his escape, they had convinced federal authorities that he was a national security threat who had stolen nuclear launch codes for unknown purposes. "They're turning the system against you," Williams said grimly. "Classic move by people with enough power to control the narrative. You're not a witness anymore, you're a suspect in nuclear espionage." Marcus realized that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Soon every law enforcement agency in Nebraska would be hunting him as a terrorist, while the real criminals used their influence to discredit his evidence and eliminate the threat he represented to their empire built on treason. Agent Sarah Chen had better arrive soon, because Marcus Chen was running out of time to expose the greatest conspiracy in American military history before it buried him along with the truth about stolen nuclear launch codes and defense contractor, betrayal of the country they were sworn to protect. The chase that had begun in an underground vault was about to expand across multiple states, with the resources of the federal government turned against the very person trying to protect American nuclear security from the criminals who had been profiting from its deliberate compromise for 3 decades. Marcus had discovered that buying an abandoned airport for $800 had made him the most wanted man in America. Hunted by both legitimate authorities who didn't know the truth and illegitimate forces who would kill to keep their secrets safe.
FBI.
Agent Sarah Chen received Deputy Williams's urgent call while reviewing classified files in her Omaha field office. But nothing in her 5 years investigating defense contractor fraud had prepared her for what her cousin Marcus was about to reveal. As she drove the 90 miles to Milbrook at dangerous speeds, Sarah's mind raced through the implications of what Williams had briefly described: stolen nuclear launch codes, defense contractor conspiracy, and a family member who had somehow stumbled into the most explosive case of her career. Sarah had always been the academic success story of the Chen family, earning degrees in computer science and criminal justice before joining the FBI's cybersecurity division. While Marcus had followed their grandfather's path into agriculture, Sarah had pursued justice through federal law enforcement, specializing in the kind of sophisticated financial crimes that modern defense contractors use to hide their corruption. But even with her extensive experience investigating defense industry malfeasance, Sarah was unprepared for the scope of what Marcus had discovered. The documents he showed her in Deputy Williams's office represented evidence of systemic treason that reached far beyond anything the FBI had previously uncovered. "Marcus, do you understand what you found here?" Sarah asked after spending an hour reviewing Colonel Patterson's investigation files. "This isn't just about stolen nuclear codes in 1994. These documents prove that major defense contractors have been deliberately creating security vulnerabilities for 30 years to justify billions in taxpayer-funded contracts." Marcus nodded. Grimly, Patterson figured it out before he was silenced. The theft wasn't espionage, it was a business model. Create the problem, then get paid to solve it, over and over again. Sarah's laptop was already connecting to secure FBI databases, cross-referencing the companies named in Patterson's files with contracts awarded since 1994. The patterns that emerged were staggering in their consistency. Every major security upgrade in American nuclear defense systems had been awarded to companies that Patterson had identified as complicit in the original theft. Stratton Defense Systems has received over $40 billion in nuclear security contracts since 1995, Sarah reported, her voice tight with controlled anger. Apex Security Solutions, another $37 billion. Morrison Technologies, $28 billion. They've been paid to fix the very vulnerabilities they created. But as Sarah dove deeper into the federal databases, she discovered something that chilled her to the bone. Active warrants had already been issued for Marcus's arrest, based on reports that he had stolen classified nuclear launch codes from a government facility. The defense contractors had moved with terrifying speed to turn the federal law enforcement apparatus against the very person trying to expose their crimes. "We have a problem," Sarah announced, reading the federal alert that had just appeared on her screen. "According to this, you're wanted for espionage, theft of classified materials, and potential terrorism. There's a federal task force being assembled to hunt you down, led by ... double quotes." She paused, her face paling as she read the name. Led by Assistant Director Michael Stratton. Marcus looked confused. Stratton? Like Stratton Defense Systems? His brother, Sarah confirmed. Assistant Director Michael Stratton has been in charge of nuclear security investigations for the past 8 years. If Stratton Defense Systems is part of this conspiracy, then the FBI official lending your manhunt is protecting his family's criminal enterprise. The implications were devastating. The very agency responsible for investigating nuclear security breaches was compromised at the highest levels, with senior officials actively protecting the defense contractors who had been stealing classified materials for 3 decades. Deputy Williams, who had been monitoring police radio traffic, looked up with alarm. "We've got multiple federal units converging on Milbrook. 15 minutes. They're not coming to investigate, they're coming to arrest Marcus and seize the evidence." Sarah's training kicked in as she assessed their rapidly deteriorating situation. "We need to get out of here immediately, but first I need to document everything and upload it to secure servers that can't be compromised by Stratton's people. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah photographed every document in Patterson's files while uploading them to encrypted FBI servers that were isolated from the main investigative databases. She also activated emergency protocols that would preserve the evidence, even if she was arrested or eliminated by the conspirators. There's a safe house network for witnesses in federal protection cases, Sarah explained as she packed her equipment. But given how deep this corruption goes, we can't use official channels. I'm taking you to someone who operates completely outside the system. As they prepared to leave Milbrook, Sarah made a series of encrypted calls to contacts throughout the federal law enforcement community. She was activating a network of agents and prosecutors who shared her suspicions about defense contractor corruption but had lacked the evidence to act against such powerful interests. Agent Martinez in the Justice Department's Public Corruption Unit has been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence, Sarah explained as they drove toward an undisclosed location. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to the defense contractor, has been investigating defense industry fraud from her position on the federal bench. We have allies, but they've been operating carefully because they knew how dangerous these people are. The safe house turned out to be a ranch owned by retired FBI agent Robert Stone, a man whose 30-year career had been dedicated to investigating the kind of high-level corruption that official channels often couldn't touch. Stone's isolated property provided both security and the sophisticated communications equipment needed to coordinate with trustworthy elements within the federal government. Son, you've kicked over the biggest anthill in American politics, Stone told Marcus after reviewing the Patterson documents. These defense contractors don't just steal nuclear codes, they control the entire system that's supposed to protect them. They've got people in the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, and probably half of Congress in their pocket. But Stone's decades of experience investigating untouchable criminals had taught him something crucial. Even the most powerful conspiracies had vulnerabilities when their secrets were finally exposed to public scrutiny. The key is simultaneous revelation, Stone explained. We can't give them time to spin the narrative or eliminate witnesses. We need to release this evidence to multiple media outlets, law enforcement agencies, and congressional committees at exactly the same time, making it impossible for them to contain the story. Sarah was already coordinating with Agent Martinez to prepare federal warrants against the defense contractor executives identified in Patterson's files, but the legal process would take time, and meanwhile, Marcus remained a fugitive from federal authorities who believed they were hunting a terrorist rather than protecting a whistleblower. The scope of the conspiracy became clearer as Stone's analysis revealed the full extent of defense contractor influence throughout the government. Companies like Stratton Defense Systems hadn't just stolen nuclear codes, they had systematically placed their former executives in key positions throughout the federal bureaucracy, creating a revolving door that ensured their continued protection and profit. Look at this, Stone said, displaying a chart that connected defense contractor personnel to government positions. Former Stratton executives now serve as Deputy Secretary of Defense, Assistant Director of the CIA's Technical Division, and Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. They've captured the entire regulatory system. Marcus studied the chart with growing horror. No wonder Patterson's investigation was shut down. He wasn't just threatening a few companies, he was threatening an entire shadow government that profits from manufactured security failures. Night fell on their second day at the safe house. Sarah received encrypted communications from allies throughout the federal system. The evidence Marcus had discovered was already generating seismic shifts within agencies that had been unknowingly protecting defense contractor criminals for decades. Agent Martinez has convinced the Attorney General to open a special investigation, Sarah reported. Judge Morrison is preparing sealed indictments against 12 defense contractor executives. Congressional leaders are demanding briefings about nuclear security breaches. The dam is starting to crack. But the defense contractors weren't passive victims of this exposure. Stone's sophisticated surveillance equipment detected multiple attempts to locate their safe house. and satellite imagery showed unmarked helicopters conducting search patterns throughout rural Nebraska. "They're hunting us with military-grade resources," Stone observed. "This isn't corporate security anymore. This is a private army trying to eliminate witnesses to treason." The breakthrough came when Sarah's FBI contacts discovered something that changed the entire dynamic of the investigation. The stolen nuclear launch codes weren't just historical artifacts from 1994, current authentication protocols that were still valid for authorizing nuclear weapons deployment. "Marcus, the codes you found in that vault aren't museum pieces," Sarah explained with barely controlled urgency. "They're active launch protocols for the Minuteman III missile system, updated as recently as last month. Someone has been maintaining current nuclear launch codes in an unsecured civilian facility for 30 years. The implications were staggering. Not only had defense contractors stolen nuclear secrets in 1994, but they had continued updating and maintaining those stolen codes, potentially giving them the ability to authorize nuclear weapons launches during any crisis that might serve their financial interests. Stone's expression was grim as he processed this information. This isn't just about past crimes anymore. They currently possess the capability to trigger World War III if it would benefit their stock prices. We're not just hunting criminals, we're preventing potential nuclear holocaust. Of the conspiracy became clear, Marcus realized that his desperate purchase of an abandoned airport had uncovered something far more dangerous than why. Historical corruption. He had discovered an active threat to human civilization, hidden in a vault beneath a forgotten hangar in rural Nebraska. The defense contractors who had built fortunes on manufactured security, failures now possessed the ultimate leverage, the ability to create nuclear crises that would justify unlimited defense spending while potentially destroying the world if their power was threatened. Sarah's secure communications revealed that federal authorities were finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the threat. Special prosecutor teams were being assembled. Military units loyal to the Constitution rather than defense contractors were being quietly positioned. And international allies were being briefed about the potential for nuclear blackmail by American corporate criminals. But even as legitimate authorities mobilized against the conspiracy, the conspirators themselves were preparing desperate measures to protect their empire. Stone's surveillance equipment detected communications, suggesting that the defense contractors were planning to eliminate all evidence and witnesses, even if it meant triggering the very nuclear crisis they had been preparing to exploit. "They're going to activate the stolen launch codes," Stone announced after intercepting encrypted transmissions between defense contractor executives. "Not to actually launch missiles, but to create a nuclear alert that justifies martial law and emergency powers that would shut down any investigation." Marcus felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. A rancher who had bought an airport to avoid homelessness had somehow become the key witness in a case that could prevent nuclear catastrophe or expose the world to unprecedented danger. The evidence he had discovered could bring justice to criminals who had committed treason for profit, but only if he survived long enough to testify before authorities who weren't compromised by the very conspiracy he was trying to expose. As Sarah prepared encrypted communications that would simultaneously alert loyal elements throughout the federal government, Marcus understood that the next 24 hours would determine whether American democracy could survive the revelation that its nuclear defense systems had been controlled by criminal enterprises for 3 decades. The abandoned airport that had seemed like his last refuge had become ground zero for the most important battle in American history. The fight to prevent defense contractors from using stolen nuclear codes to trigger crises that would destroy democracy while enriching the very criminals who orchestrated the collapse. Colonel Patterson's investigation, preserved in a vault beneath Hangar 7, was finally going to see the light of day. But first, Marcus Chen and his allies would have to survive the full fury of corporate criminals who possessed both private armies and nuclear launch codes, and who were willing to risk civilization itself to protect their profits from 30 years of manufactured security failures. The truth about stolen nuclear protocols was emerging. But the defense contractors who had built an empire on treason were prepared to burn the world down rather than face justice for their crimes against humanity. The emergency session of Congress convened at 6:47 a.m. on a gray November morning at 72 hours after Marcus Chen's evidence had simultaneously reached the Attorney General, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the leadership of both political parties. The most classified briefing in American legislative history was about to reveal that the nation's nuclear defense systems has been controlled by criminal conspirators for 3 decades. Marcus sat in the Witness Protection section of the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room, flanked by FBI agent Sarah Chen, and retired. It's toned after 2 weeks of the most intensive federal investigation in modern history. The scope of the defense contractor conspiracy had proven even more extensive than Colonel Patterson's files had suggested. Committee Chairman Senator Patricia Morrison, who had taken her late husband's name and coincidentally shared it with one of the implicated defense contractors, though with no family connection, called the session to order with unprecedented security measures in place. Every person in the room had been vetted by intelligence agencies, and electronic jamming prevented any unauthorized communications from leaving the Capitol building. "Ladies and gentlemen," Senator Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of constitutional crisis, "we are here to address the most serious breach of national security in American history. The evidence you will hear today reveals that defense." Marcus studied the chart with growing horror. No wonder Patterson's investigation was shut down. He wasn't just threatening a few companies, he was threatening an entire shadow government that profits from manufactured security failures. Night fell on their second day at the safe house. Sarah received encrypted communications from allies throughout the federal system. The evidence Marcus had discovered was already generating seismic shifts within agencies that had been unknowingly protecting defense contractor criminals for decades. "Agent Martinez has convinced the Attorney General to open a special investigation," Sarah reported. "Judge Morrison is preparing sealed indictments against 12 defense contractor executives. Congressional leaders are demanding briefings about nuclear security breaches. The dam is starting to crack." But the defense contractors weren't passive victims of this exposure. Stone's sophisticated surveillance equipment detected multiple attempts to locate their safe house, and satellite imagery showed unmarked helicopters conducting search patterns throughout rural Nebraska. "They're hunting us with military-grade resources," Stone observed. "This isn't corporate security anymore. This is a private army trying to eliminate witnesses to treason." The breakthrough came when Sarah's FBI contacts discovered something that changed the entire dynamic of the investigation. The stolen nuclear launch codes weren't just historical artifacts from 1994, current authentication protocols that were still valid for authorizing nuclear weapons deployment. "Marcus, the codes you found in that vault aren't museum pieces," Sarah explained with barely controlled urgency. "They're active launch protocols for the Minuteman III missile system, updated as recently as last month. Someone has been maintaining current nuclear launch codes in an unsecured civilian facility for 30 years. The implications were staggering. Not only had defense contractors stolen nuclear secrets in 1994, but they had continued updating and maintaining those stolen codes, potentially giving them the ability to authorize nuclear weapons launches during any crisis that might serve their financial interests. Stone's expression was grim as he processed this information. This isn't just about past crimes anymore. They currently possess the capability to trigger World War III if it would benefit. FBI Director Harrison took the witness stand next, presenting evidence that vindicated Colonel Patterson's suppressed investigation, while revealing how deeply the conspiracy had penetrated federal law enforcement, defense contractor personnel, and key government positions had created a shadow network that operated beyond traditional oversight. Assistant Director Michael Stratton has been relieved of all duties pending investigation, Harrison testified, along with Deputy Director Jennifer Morrison of our Cybersecurity Division, Assistant Director David Apex of our Counterintelligence Division, and 17 other senior officials whose loyalty to defense contractor interests superseded their oath to protect American security. Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and horror as the scope of institutional betrayal became clear. The very agencies responsible for protecting nuclear secrets had been controlled by the criminals who had stolen them, creating a perfect closed loop that had prevented detection for 3 decades. But the most explosive testimony came from Dr. Elizabeth Patterson, Colonel James Patterson's daughter, who had spent her career as a nuclear physicist while secretly continuing her father's investigation. Her appearance before the committee had been arranged by Sarah Chen, who had located her through military family networks after discovering her father's files. "My father died believing that his evidence would never see the light of day," Dr. Patterson testified, her voice steady, despite visible emotion. "He spent the last years of his life documenting how defense contractors had turned American nuclear security into a profit center. But he was silenced by the very system he had served faithfully for 25 years. Dr. Patterson's testimony revealed the human cost of the conspiracy. Military officers who had questioned security vulnerabilities were systematically destroyed through career sabotage, forced retirements, and in some cases, suspicious accidents that had never been properly investigated. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, Captain Robert Davis, Major Jennifer Thompson all raised questions about nuclear security protocols between 1995 and 2010. Dr. Patterson continued, "All died in accidents that were never thoroughly investigated. My father believed they were murdered to protect the conspiracy, and recent evidence suggests he was correct." The committee room fell silent as members absorbed the implications. The defense contractors hadn't just committed treason and fraud. They had potentially murdered American military officers to protect their criminal enterprise. Marcus was called to testify as the committee's final witness. He approached the microphone with the same mixture of determination and fear that had carried him through the past month. A bankrupt rancher who had bought an abandoned airport was about to address the United States Congress about the most important national security case in American history. "Senators, I never intended to become involved in any of this," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the packed committee room. "I bought that airport because it was the only property I could afford after losing my family's ranch. I was just trying to survive, not uncover government conspiracies." He paused, looking around the room at senators, generals, and federal officials who were hanging on his every word. But Colonel Patterson preserved that evidence because he believed someone would eventually find it and complete the work he couldn't finish. He had faith that the truth would matter, even if it took 30 years to emerge. Marcus's testimony walked the committee through his discovery process, the powered security system, the underground archive, Patterson's meticulous investigation, and the realization that defense contractors had built an empire on deliberately compromised American security. "What struck me most about Colonel Patterson's files," Marcus continued, "was how methodical the corruption was. This wasn't opportunistic theft, it was systematic transformation of American defense into a profit-generating scheme, where the companies paid to protect us were actually the greatest threat to our security." Senator Morrison asked the question that had driven Marcus to risk everything. "Mr. Chen, what convinced you to preserve this evidence despite the obvious personal danger?" Marcus thought of his grandfather's stories about working on the Transcontinental Railroad, building infrastructure that would serve future generations. "My family has been in America for 4 generations, Senator. We've always believed that this country's strength comes from people willing to do what's right even when it's difficult. Colonel Patterson did what was right when he preserved that evidence. I just continued what he started." The committee's final session addressed the question of accountability and reform. Attorney General Martinez outlined the legal framework for prosecuting defense contractor executives, while ensuring that legitimate national security operations weren't disrupted by the investigation. Grand juries have been impaneled in 6 federal districts, Martinez reported. Indictments will be unsealed simultaneously to prevent flight or evidence destruction. We expect to arrest 47 defense contractor executives, 12 current or former government officials, and 5 active military officers who participated in the conspiracy. The financial penalties would be unprecedented. Complete forfeiture of all contracts awarded through fraudulent means. Criminal restitution for stolen taxpayer funds. Civil penalties that would effectively destroy the corporate entities that had profited from treason. But the most important outcome was systemic reform. Director Harrison outlined new protocols for nuclear security oversight that would prevent future infiltration by private interests, while the Pentagon announced the creation of an independent Inspector General's office, specifically tasked with monitoring defense contractor relationships.
Oh.
Never again will private corporations possess access to nuclear launch protocols. Defense Secretary Michael Thompson testified. And never again will the revolving door between defense contractors and government positions operate without rigorous oversight and mandatory cooling-off periods. As the congressional hearing concluded, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from bankruptcy to the center of American history. The abandoned airport that had represented his last desperate option had become the catalyst for the most important national security reform in decades. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the renovated control tower of what was now called the Patterson Center for Government Accountability, watching as the first class of federal investigators toured the facility where Colonel Patterson's evidence had been preserved for 3 decades. The airport had been transformed into a training center where government employees learned to recognize and report corruption, ensuring that future conspiracies couldn't operate in the shadows. The financial settlement from the defense contractor prosecutions had provided Marcus with resources he had never imagined possessing. Rather than returning to ranching, I had chosen to dedicate his life to ensuring that Colonel Patterson's sacrifice had lasting meaning. Sarah Chen had been promoted to Assistant Director of the FBI's new Corporate Accountability Division, where she led investigations into defense contractor fraud with the kind of resources and authority that previous generations of investigators had lacked. The bureau that had once protected corporate criminals was now aggressively pursuing justice for their victims. Dr. Elizabeth Patterson had joined the Patterson Center as its chief scientific advisor, finally able to complete the work her father had begun. Her research into defense contractor infiltration of government agencies had become the foundation for new security protocols that prevented the kind of systematic corruption that had threatened American nuclear security for 3 decades. The defense contractors themselves had faced unprecedented accountability. Stratton Defense Systems, Apex Security Solutions, and Morrison Technologies had been dissolved as criminal enterprises, their assets forfeited to compensate taxpayers for 30 years of fraudulent contracts. Former executives faced sentences ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment for treason and conspiracy charges. More importantly, the nuclear launch codes that had been stolen in 1994 were finally secured through completely new systems that were immune to private contractor infiltration. American nuclear security was stronger than it had been since the end of the Cold War. It was protected by oversight mechanisms that had been built on the lessons learned from the Patterson investigation. Marcus often stood in the archive vault beneath Hangar 7, now preserved as a historical exhibit, and reflected on Colonel Patterson's faith that the truth would eventually matter. The officer who had sacrificed his career to protect evidence of defense contractor treason had been posthumously. FBI Director Harrison took the witness stand next, presenting evidence that vindicated Colonel Patterson's suppressed investigation. The small town of Milbrook had prospered as well, transformed from a struggling rural community into a center for government accountability training that drew visitors from around the world. Deputy Tom Williams had been promoted to sheriff and served as the Patterson Center's liaison with local law enforcement, ensuring that small-town values of integrity and service remained central to the facility's mission. On the first anniversary of his discovery, Marcus addressed a gathering of government officials, congressional leaders, and international observers who had come to study how American democracy had survived its greatest internal threat. Colonel Patterson couldn't have known that his evidence would be found by a bankrupt rancher who bought an abandoned airport for $800, Marcus told the assembled crowd. But he preserved that evidence because he believed in something larger than his own career or safety. He believed that truth and justice would eventually prevail if people were willing to fight for them. Marcus paused, looking out at the audience that included survivors of military officers who had been killed for questioning defense contractor security failures, investigators who had risked their careers to pursue the truth, and ordinary citizens who had demanded accountability from their government. The Patterson investigation taught us that democracy's greatest strength isn't our military or our economy, it's ordinary people who refuse to accept corruption as inevitable. Colonel Patterson was one such person. Every federal agent, prosecutor, and congressional leader who supported this investigation was another. Democracy survives because people choose to make it survive. As the crowd dispersed and evening fell, over the Nebraska plains, Marcus returned to the apartment above the control tower, where his journey had begun. The view from his window now showed not abandoned infrastructure, but a thriving center for government accountability that had trained thousands of federal employees to recognize and resist the kind of corruption that had once threatened civilization itself. The ranch's family had lost to drought and debt had been tragic, but it had led him to something more important than cattle or crops. He had become the guardian of truth in an age when powerful interests regularly tried to bury inconvenient facts. And he had helped ensure that American democracy remained strong enough to confront even its most dangerous internal enemies. Marcus Chen had purchased an abandoned airport with his last $800, seeking only shelter and a chance to rebuild his shattered life. Instead, he had discovered that some purchases changed not just the buyer's circumstances, but the course of history itself. The nuclear launch protocols that had been stolen and hidden for 30 years were finally secure. The defense contractors who had profited from treason were facing justice. The government agencies that had been corrupted were being reformed. And the colonel, who had preserved evidence at great personal cost, had finally received the vindication he had died believing would never come. In the end, Marcus had learned that the most valuable discoveries aren't always what we seek, but what we find when we have the courage to look beyond our immediate circumstances and recognize that some truths are worth any sacrifice to preserve and protect. The abandoned airport that had seemed like his last resort had become the foundation for his life's most important work, ensuring that the truth could never again be buried so deeply that it took 30 years in desperate circumstances to bring it back to light. Colonel James Patterson's faith in eventual justice had been vindicated. Marcus Chen's desperate gamble had been transformed into lasting purpose. And American democracy had proven that even its most dangerous enemies couldn't permanently suppress the truth when ordinary people refused to let corruption flourish in darkness. The story that began with a bankrupt rancher's last $800 had ended with the restoration of integrity to the systems that protected human civilization itself. Some investments, Marcus had learned, return far more than money. They return faith in the possibility that justice and truth can prevail against even the most powerful forces of corruption and greed. This concludes the story of Marcus Chen and his discovery at Riverside Municipal Airport. The truth, the small town of Milbrook had prospered as well, transformed from a struggling rural community into a center for government accountability training that drew visitors from around the world. Deputy Tom Williams had been promoted to sheriff and served as the Patterson Center's liaison with local law enforcement, ensuring that small-town values of integrity and service remained central to the facility's mission. On the first anniversary of his discovery, Marcus addressed a gathering of government officials, congressional leaders, and international observers who had come to study how American democracy had survived its greatest internal threat. Colonel Patterson couldn't have known that his evidence would be found by a bankrupt rancher who bought an abandoned airport for $800, Marcus told the assembled crowd. But he preserved that evidence because he believed in something larger than his own career or safety. He believed that truth and justice would eventually prevail if people were willing to fight for them. Marcus paused, looking out at the audience that included survivors of military officers who had been killed for questioning defense contractors' security failures, investigators who had risked their careers to pursue the truth, and ordinary citizens who had demanded accountability from their government. The Patterson investigation taught us that democracy's greatest strength isn't our military or our economy, it's ordinary people who refuse to accept corruption as inevitable. Colonel Patterson was one such person. Every federal agent, prosecutor, and congressional leader who supported this investigation was another. Democracy survives because people choose to make it survive. As the crowd dispersed and evening fell, over the Nebraska plains, Marcus returned to the apartment above the control tower, where his journey had begun. The view from his window now showed not abandoned infrastructure, but a thriving center for government accountability that had trained thousands of federal employees to recognize and resist the kind of corruption that had once threatened civilization itself. The ranch's family had lost to drought and debt had been tragic, but it had led him to something more important than cattle or crops. He had become the guardian of truth in an age when powerful interests regularly tried to bury inconvenient facts. And he had helped ensure that American democracy remained strong enough to confront even its most dangerous internal enemies. Marcus Chen had purchased an abandoned airport with his last $800, seeking only shelter and a chance to rebuild his shattered life. Instead, he had discovered that some purchases changed not just the buyer's circumstances, but the course of history itself. The nuclear launch protocols that had been stolen and hidden for 30 years were finally secure. The defense contractors who had profited from treason were facing justice. The government agencies that had been corrupted were being reformed. And the colonel, who had preserved evidence at great personal cost, had finally received the vindication he had died believing would never come. In the end, Marcus had learned that the most valuable discoveries aren't always what we seek, but what we find when we have the courage to look beyond our immediate circumstances and recognize that some truths are worth any sacrifice to preserve and protect. The abandoned airport that had seemed like his last resort had become the foundation for his life's most important work, ensuring that the truth could never again be buried so deeply that it took 30 years in desperate circumstances to bring it back to light. Colonel James Patterson's faith in eventual justice had been vindicated. Marcus Chen's desperate gamble had been transformed into lasting purpose. And American democracy had proven that even its most dangerous enemies couldn't permanently suppress the truth when ordinary people refused to let corruption flourish in darkness. The story that began with a bankrupt rancher's last $800 had ended with the restoration of integrity to the systems that protected human civilization itself. Some investments, Marcus had learned, return far more than money. They return faith in the possibility that justice and truth can prevail against even the most powerful forces of corruption and greed. This concludes the story of Marcus Chen and his discovery at Riverside Municipal Airport. The truth about stolen nuclear launch protocols finally emerged. Justice was served. And American democracy proved resilient enough to confront and defeat even its most dangerous internal enemies. Sometimes the most desperate circumstances lead to the Sarah Chen, now FBI director after her predecessor's retirement, addressed the conference about the ongoing global investigation into defense contractor corruption. Her bureau had established permanent liaisons with law enforcement agencies in 36 countries, creating an international network dedicated to preventing the kind of systematic infiltration that had once threatened nuclear security. We've learned that corruption this sophisticated requires international cooperation to defeat, Director Chen explained. Defense contractors operated across borders, using subsidiaries and shell companies to hide their activities from any single nation's oversight. It's only by sharing intelligence and coordinating investigations globally can we ensure that private interests never again capture the systems designed to protect civilization. The numbers from 5 years of investigation were staggering. 847 defense contractor executives arrested worldwide. $2.3 trillion in fraudulent contracts identified and canceled. 156 government officials removed from positions where they had served corporate rather than public interests. The financial restitution had funded infrastructure projects, educational initiatives, and social programs that had strengthened democratic institutions rather than enriching private shareholders. But the most important changes were systemic, rather than punitive. The new international protocols governing defense contractor relationships had eliminated the revolving door between private companies and government positions, established independent oversight for all military procurement, and created whistleblower protection systems that encouraged government employees to report suspected corruption without fear of retaliation. During the conference's final session, Marcus announced his decision to step back from public advocacy and return to the kind of hands-on work that had defined his earlier life, The Patterson Center had grown beyond anything he had imagined when it was established, and new leadership was needed to guide its continued evolution. This center represents Colonel Patterson's legacy, not mine, Marcus explained to the gathered delegates. My role was to discover what he had preserved and ensure that it reached people who could act on it. That work is complete. Now, I want to return to the kind of practical problem solving that got me into this situation in the first place. Marcus's next chapter would involve establishing agricultural programs that applied the lessons learned from government accountability work to sustainable farming practices. The Chen family's ranching legacy had been lost to drought and corporate agriculture. But Marcus intended to help other farming families avoid the kind of desperation that had driven him to buy an abandoned airport with his last $800. The Patterson Center would continue under Dr. Elizabeth Patterson's leadership, with Sarah Chen serving as its federal liaison and retired agent Robert Stone managing its investigative training programs. The institution that had grown from Marcus's accidental discovery would outlive all of its founders, ensuring that future generations of government employees would understand their responsibility to serve public rather than private interests. As the conference concluded and international delegates departed for their home countries, Marcus found himself alone in the archive vault beneath Hangar 7, where his journey had begun 5 years earlier. The room now served as a museum exhibit, preserving Colonel Patterson's original files, alongside documentation of the global investigation they had inspired. Standing among the filing cabinets that had once contained the most dangerous secrets in American history, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed his personal catastrophe into a catalyst for worldwide reform. The foreclosure that had seemed like the end of his family's agricultural legacy had led him to discover and preserve evidence that had strengthened democratic institutions around the world. Patricia Williams, now in her 60s, but still serving as the Patterson Center's community liaison, found Marcus in the vault as evening light faded across the Nebraska plains. She had become something of a local celebrity for her role in connecting Marcus with the information that had made his discovery possible. But she remained the same kind-hearted county clerk who had welcomed a desperate rancher to Milbrook 5 years earlier. Sarah Chen, now FBI director after her predecessor's retirement, addressed the conference about the ongoing global investigation into defense contractor corruption. Her bureau had established permanent liaisons with law enforcement agencies in 36 countries, creating an international network dedicated to preventing the kind of systematic infiltration that had once threatened nuclear security. We've learned that corruption this sophisticated requires international cooperation to defeat, Director Chen explained. Defense contractors operated across borders, using subsidiaries and shell companies to hide their activities from any single nation's oversight. It's only by sharing intelligence and coordinating investigations globally can we ensure that private interests never again capture the systems designed to protect civilization. The numbers from 5 years of investigation were staggering. 847 defense contractor executives arrested worldwide. $2.3 trillion in fraudulent contracts identified and canceled. 156 government officials removed from positions where they had served corporate rather than public interests. The financial restitution had funded infrastructure projects, educational initiatives, and social programs that had strengthened democratic institutions rather than enriching private shareholders. But the most important changes were systemic, rather than punitive. The new international protocols governing defense contractor relationships had eliminated the revolving door between private companies and government positions, established independent oversight for all military procurement, and created whistleblower protection systems that encouraged government employees to report suspected corruption without fear of retaliation. During the conference's final session, Marcus announced his decision to step back from public advocacy and return to the kind of hands-on work that had defined his earlier life. The Patterson Center had grown beyond anything he had imagined when it was established, and new leadership was needed to guide its continued evolution. This center represents Colonel Patterson's legacy, not mine, Marcus explained to the gathered delegates. My role was to discover what he had preserved and ensure that it reached people who could act on it. That work is complete. Now, I want To return to the kind of practical problem-solving that got me into this situation in the first place, Marcus's next chapter would involve establishing agricultural programs that applied the lessons learned from government accountability work to sustainable farming practices. The Chen family's ranching legacy had been lost to drought and corporate agriculture, but Marcus intended to help other farming families avoid the kind of desperation that had driven him to buy an abandoned airport with his last $800. The Patterson Center would continue under Dr. Elizabeth Patterson's leadership, with Sarah Chen serving as its federal liaison and retired agent Robert Stone managing its investigative training programs. The institution that had grown from Marcus's accidental discovery would outlive all of its founders, ensuring that future generations of government employees would understand their responsibility to serve public rather than private interests. As the conference concluded and international delegates departed for their home countries, Marcus found himself alone in the archive vault beneath Hangar 7, where his journey had begun 5 years earlier. The room now served as a museum exhibit, preserving Colonel Patterson's original files, alongside documentation of the global investigation they had inspired. Standing among the filing cabinets that had once contained the most dangerous secrets in American history, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed his personal catastrophe into a catalyst for worldwide reform. The foreclosure that had seemed like the end of his family's agricultural legacy had led him to discover and preserve evidence that had strengthened democratic institutions around the world. Patricia Williams, now in her 60s, but still serving as the Patterson Center's community liaison, found Marcus in the vault as evening light faded across the Nebraska plains. She had become something of a local celebrity for her role in connecting Marcus with the information that had made his discovery possible. But she remained the same kind-hearted county clerk who had welcomed a desperate rancher to Milbrook 5 years earlier. "Tommy would be proud of what this place has become," Patricia said, referring to her late husband, whose suspicions about the airport's classified activities had provided Marcus with crucial context for understanding what he had found. He always said there were secrets here that mattered more than most people realized. Even he couldn't have imagined how important they really were. Marcus nodded. The abandoned airport that had cost him $800 had taught him the most valuable lesson of his life, that the most important discoveries often come not from seeking treasure, but from having the courage to investigate when something doesn't seem right, and the integrity to act on inconvenient truths, even when powerful forces prefer that they remain buried. Marcus Chen had bought Riverside Municipal Airport seeking only shelter after losing everything he thought mattered. Instead, he had found his life's true purpose, ensuring that the truth could never again be hidden so deeply that it took decades and desperate circumstances to bring it back to light. Colonel Patterson's faith in eventual justice had been vindicated. The defense contractors who had betrayed their country for profit had faced consequences. The nuclear security systems they had compromised had been strengthened beyond their previous vulnerabilities. And ordinary people around the world had been reminded that democracy survives because citizens choose to make it survive, one act of courage at a time. The story that began with a desperate rancher's last $800 had become a testament to the power of preserved truth and the extraordinary things that happen when ordinary people refuse to accept corruption as inevitable. Some investments, Marcus had learned, return far more than money. They return hope in the possibility that justice and truth can prevail against even the most powerful forces of greed and betrayal. As Marcus drifted off to sleep in his modest house beside the airport that had changed everything, he smiled at the thought that somewhere in the world, another ordinary person might be discovering another inconvenient truth that powerful interests had tried to bury. Thanks to the systems established through the Patterson investigation, that person would have allies, resources, and protection that Colonel Patterson had never possessed. The cycle of truth-seeking and justice would continue, strengthened by each generation's willingness to choose integrity over comfort and the public good over private benefit. Democracy would survive because people like Marcus Chen, Colonel Patterson, thousands of others had proven that ordinary citizens could defeat even the most sophisticated corruption when they possessed the courage to act on their convictions. The abandoned airport had taught Marcus that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased with money. They had to be earned through choices that honored something larger than personal benefit. His $800 investment had returned dividends that would continue generating interest for generations. Stronger democratic institutions, safer nuclear security systems, and renewed faith in the possibility that truth and justice could prevail against any odds. Some stories end with personal triumph, others end with systemic change. The best stories, Marcus had learned, end with both individuals discovering their true purpose, while making the world safer and more just for everyone who comes after them. The Patterson Center for Government Accountability would continue its vital work long after Marcus Chen and his contemporaries were gone, ensuring that future generations would never again face the choice between accepting corruption or fighting it alone. The truth that Colonel Patterson had preserved in a vault beneath an abandoned hangar had grown into a global movement that proved democracy's greatest strength: ordinary people's extraordinary capacity to choose justice over convenience, integrity over profit, and the common good over personal benefit. Marcus Chen's legacy would not be measured in acres or cattle or agricultural production, but in the knowledge that he had helped ensure that no private interest could ever again capture the systems designed to protect human civilization. The rancher who had lost everything had gained something infinitely more valuable: the certainty that his life had mattered in the most fundamental way possible. Thus concludes the complete story of Marcus Chen and his discovery at Riverside Municipal Airport. From a desperate $800 purchase to global democratic reform, his journey proves that sometimes our greatest losses lead us to our most important discoveries, and that ordinary people can change the world when they have the courage to pursue truth, regardless of personal cost. The Patterson Center continues its vital work, ensuring that future generations will inherit democratic institutions strong enough to resist even the most sophisticated forms of corruption and betrayal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.